It's time now for a business update. I'm joined for that by Yuka Roya. Hi there.
Hello, Catherine.
Now we're starting off with this story that's just going to dominate the news for the next few days, perhaps weeks. I think we're talking about reforms to the French labour laws. We've been talking about it for a little while. Today's the day that the Prime Minister finally presents those plans.
That's right. It's the mother of all reforms, in the words of Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire. Now, an overhaul of France's rigid labour code is something that past governments have tried over and over, but had to water down in the face of street protests. It's a big political challenge, of course, for Emmanuel Macron too, who was elected in May on a promise to shake up the sluggish economy and reduce unemployment. The aim is to encourage companies to hire more people by making it easier to fire them and negotiate working conditions directly with staff. Employers say it's about time this happened, but unions are up in arms.
In fact, the first reform that he has decided to do is a labour law reform. So that's a very important signal to give to the world community. And you have to do it at the beginning of your mandate. People are striking a little bit, they are not happy. But then you see the results of it 2 years or 3 years later. And this is what has to be done.
Il faut que tous les salariés puissent.
All employees must be able to rely on unions for advice, because the rules and social codes in the workplace can get very complicated. I don't see why unions should be sidelined in any company, whatever its size.
France 24's Chris Moore is at the Prime Minister's office, where the government is set to have one last round of talks with the unions. Chris, what are we expecting to see there today?
Well, today we're expecting the French government, in the form of Prime Minister Edouard Philippe, to present the final drafts of these plans to reform the labour code. This after weeks of negotiations, both with bosses' representatives and with trades unions. Now, as you were saying there, all of this was a key part of Emmanuel Macron's election campaign. He says that the Code de Travail, the labour code here in France, is a series of rules and regulations which has been built up over decades. It's simply too rigid, too strict, too inflexible to create jobs and reduce unemployment in a modern economy. He wants to prune it. He wants to do things like capping the payouts given by unemployment tribunals. He wants to, as you said, give companies themselves, individual companies, more freedom to negotiate working terms and conditions. And he wants to give multinationals more power to lay people off in times of economic downturn. He's not going, if you like, full free market, as his right-wing rival for the presidency, François Fillon, have been promising. Emmanuel Macron's going for more of a kind of carrot and stick policy, saying that yes, there will be liberalisation on the one side, but on the other side there'll be better protection for unemployed people, and he hopes more jobs for unemployed people to take up.
So, as you said, it's certainly a wide-ranging, ambitious plan, but past governments have tried similar reforms, but ultimately had to water them down. How much resistance is President Macron going to meet?
Well, in a way, he's got a pretty strong hand. First of all, he's been honest about the fact throughout his campaign that he intends to push these through Parliament by ordinance, kind of the French equivalent of an executive order in the United States, thus circumventing a lot of the debate. He also, of course, following his meteoric rise to the presidency, has a large majority in Parliament. That said, one of the major unions, traditionally one of the more militant unions, the CGT, is calling people out onto the streets in September, as is the leader of the France Unbowed movement, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the left-wing candidate for the presidency, who came ever so close to getting through to the second round. He too is calling for protests. And in the past, when French politicians have tried to do this sort of thing, and when protests have built up a head of steam on the streets, they've been forced to abandon their reforms.
And what's the plan for the government? What's the next move?
As I said, Emmanuel Macron has been very clear from the start that he wants to move ahead very quickly with these reforms. In his view, the reforms which took place under his predecessor, François Hollande, were a step in the right direction, but didn't go far enough and took too long to pass, and faced their fair share of protest themselves on the streets. He wants to go much faster by pushing it through Parliament. The idea is that all of this will be on the statute book by the end of September, and the Macron government will be hoping that these reforms start to bear fruit quickly.
Chris Moore, thank you.
All right, well, the reform plan's certainly very ambitious, as Chris was outlining there. It's also the first big challenge for someone who's very new to their job, France's new Labour minister.
That's right, Muriel Pénicaud. She's been very busy talking intensively with the business leaders and union representatives for the past week to finalise the plan to reform the 3,000-page Labour Code. She comes from the private sector with 40 years of experience dealing with unions, but she is, as you said, a political novice. Simon Harding takes a look at the minister's negotiating skills.
Labour Minister Muriel Pénicaud is known to be direct. That is one of the reasons why France's Prime Minister chose to work with her.
I enjoy working with Muriel. She's precise, she knows her stuff, she's creative. It's a real pleasure.
She is well known among entrepreneurs and unionists alike. After a 40-year career which started in the Labour Ministry, her most prominent position was in Danone's Human Resources Department, an experience that likely contributed to forging her ideology.
I belong to those who believe that social and economic issues go hand in hand. That's what drives me.
This principle appears to be her guideline for drafting the labour reform that French President Emmanuel Macron is trying to implement this fall. The reform is controversial since it tries to facilitate both the hiring of and firing of employees. Muriel Pénicaud hopes that her ability to talk to all sides will be her strength in the Labour Code negotiations.
There's a mutual trust, but that doesn't mean we agree on everything. But we're not always looking for a possible hidden trap or a trick in a bill.
My style is direct. It has its advantages and drawbacks. The advantage is that it's always sincere. There's no hidden agenda or pretense.
But there is also a shadow hanging over her reputation. Some of her decisions at Danone have been criticised for furthering personal gains, as well as her handling of Business France, a public institution which threw a lavish party for Emmanuel Macron in Las Vegas without having made the compulsory requests.